I don't know where to start. Until now, it's only felt like a bad trip. It started as any normal night for a college loner. A game console with 4 controls, a party game guaranteed to send us to the ER for carpal tunnel, and enough beer to drown a mid-sized dog. It was destined to be a night of stupidity, glee, and light-hearted antics. Since I'm the pre-gaming master, I already had a few drinks down to celebrate the end of finals week, and before we go back home for the holidays, it was amazing to let my brain have a break after all the stress it suffered. Potential dependence be damned. JT was the first to show up. If I had to describe him in a few words, it would be if Abe Lincoln was built like a Mack truck, with fingers like sausages. Despite his imposing stature, he's relatively mild-mannered, but just a beer in and he becomes the Tom Brady of our drunken game nights. Cam was next. He was by far the most social and the only one who's out and about every week, getting some action. The last of our pitiful party was Phil, my roommate. Phil isn't his actual name, it's Stefan, but when money was tight, we lived off the cheesesteaks from the sandwich shop he works at for a week straight. After that, the name just stuck. Anyway, the game night was a double feature. The first event was 1 Grand Prix of Mario Kart, followed by rounds upon rounds of classic Mario Party, where the current first place players and minigame winners take sips of a drink of their choice. We had made it past the Mario Kart section with barely a buzz except for Cam, who was the lightweight of the group, which was the reason for Mario Kart. Otherwise, Mario Party wouldn't be fair. At the end of the Mario Party game, Phil had thoroughly crushed us all due to bonus stars, and so the rest of us chugged the remainder of our drinks as we set up the movie marathon to end off an amazing night. As JT fumbled through the Roku menus to open HBO Max, we heard a knock on the door. Phil, being the only one of us capable of at least holding a coherent conversation, answered the guest. It was the landlord's annoying younger brother. This kid is always wrecking things in the common area. Apparently, he's on probation for breaking a kid's femur after the jerk had bullied his friend. I can respect the sentiment, but I guess the other kid's parents filed a restraining order, so the little brat came to live in the building with his older brother. He wasn't loud like he normally is, so he must be on rent collection. I somehow managed to get out where I put the rent money between all the slurred speech. We went back to picking a movie when we heard another knock. The brat is back, and he wants to watch the movie with us. Since none of us were in the right state of mind, we let him stay. We finally decided on a movie. I fell asleep a quarter of the way in and started what may be the worst night of my life. It was a pleasant dream. I woke up next to my buddies and the brat in the same room. We're all just stretching, Phil already picking up some of our stuff in the process. As per my typical routine, I go to the windows to hopefully catch a whiff of the coffee shop across the street from the apartment complex. What I came across was a solid brick wall on the other side of the window. Next thing I know, we all hear a loud bang and turn to find the brat's upper arm scraped by the bullet. Blood slowly trickled down to his forearm as the poor kid hyperventilated through the pain. Me, half dazed but sobered by the gunshot, instructed the others to get away from the front of the door. I reached my hand across the door to the knob and quickly opened the door, firing one more shot at the other wall. After sweeping the doorway, we found a gun hooked up to a mechanism that fired a bullet when the door opened. I had seen enough body horror and torture movies to spot all the cliché traps. After disabling a few more obvious traps, we reached the end of the hall where it bended to the left. After trying to peek around the corner for a few minutes, I determined that there was no immediate danger. However, Cam took that as a sign to make a break for the elevator and set off another trap. I luckily managed to grab him and pull him to safety. When I felt this sharp pain in my leg, a bit of shrapnel left a cut in my calf. After dressing my wound, me and the other guys inspected the scene and found that what cut me was shrapnel from a pipe bomb trap, which was set up in the first room to the left. Whoever crafted these traps surely wanted us dead. JT, who was more toward the back, told us he heard footsteps. We all jumped up and rushed to see if there was anyone else in peril, but what we found still haunts me every night. It was a man in an off-white suit that seemed to glow in the darkness, and he was wearing an old bowler hat or fedora. We all ran towards him shouting, but he didn't respond. He just stood there. He stood there until we were about 5 feet away, and then he started moving. He started to slowly turn his head, and that's when we saw what he looked like. His face was compromised of nothing but darkness, and in place of his eyes seemed to be glowing orbs. We all violently shook awake from the worst group trip imaginable. The first thing on our minds were, why was the apartment complex booby-trapped, and who was the mysterious Hat Man? Yet, that wasn't even the worst part, because I looked down to see my calf and saw about an inch-deep cut and the bloodstain left on my pajamas. Whatever just happened was painfully real. When I was a little girl, I had an imaginary friend. I called him Mr. Paperbag. 4 years old, I moved with my parents to a small town in Connecticut. I didn't have any friends there, and my parents couldn't accompany me because of busy work. I was lonely, and then I started imagining some non-existent partners. That's when Mr. Paperbag appeared. He was tall and always wore a black suit. I couldn't see his face because he had a linen paper bag on his head, and that's why I called him Mr. Paperbag. There were 2 holes in the paper bag. I guess Mr. Paperbag was looking at me through the holes, but I couldn't see his eyes through them. Mr. Paperbag never talks, but he was willing to play every game with me, even the stupid ones. He stayed with me for many years, even after I entered elementary school. I could still see him when I played games with my friends in school. I could sometimes see him standing alone in the corner, but he never interrupted me. As I grew older, my life was full of new things. There were more friends around me, so gradually I no longer needed Mr. Paperbag, and one day he just disappeared. I know it's common to have an imaginary friend in childhood, especially if you're the only child in the family and your parents are busy at work. What I want to say is that several years later, I started seeing Mr. Paperbag again. After graduating from college, my parents divorced and started their own families. I was thrown back into loneliness. Fortunately, I met Will, the man who makes me think that I'm worthy of entrusting my life to. We rented a small apartment and worked hard, hoped to save enough money to get married. A few days ago, I was walking home alone after finishing my shift at night. As I was walking through an alley, I felt someone was watching me from behind. I looked back reflexively, but no one was there. However, the feeling of being peeped was so obvious that it made my skin crawl. I became more alert, paying close attention to the sounds around me, but except for my footsteps, everything was dead silent. Suddenly, a cat screamed from behind me, which scared me half to death. I turned around immediately and found a vague figure in the dim light. Even though it has been many years, I still recognized it was Mr. Paperbag, or maybe just a pervert disguised as that. I quickened my pace and secretly prayed he would not catch up with me. Fortunately, nothing happened. Do you feel like there's someone else? While eating breakfast, Will asked. No, why? I asked as I drank my coffee. I don't know. I thought I saw someone when I went to the bathroom last night. Will was confused. Have you checked around? I suddenly remembered the weird man I met. Yes, but found nothing. Will answered. Maybe we're overreacting? I smiled and kissed him, then went out to work. I saw that weird man again, this time in our apartment. When I got up in the middle of the night to drink water, I saw him in the kitchen. I screamed immediately, but no sound came out of my throat, as if someone had choked me or taken the sound out of my mouth. My body was frozen in place. But it's not that I don't want to move. I can't. The man slowly walked towards me, pointing at a knife on the counter. I tried to see his eyes through the hole in the paper bag, but all I saw was darkness. I closed my eyes and accepted my fate helplessly. That was the only thing I could do. Suddenly, the light was turned on. I opened my eyes again, and the weird man had disappeared. What are you doing, hon? Will asked worriedly. I cried in Will's arms, telling him over and over that I had just seen someone in the kitchen. So where did he go? Will asked. I shook my head because I didn't see it. Will checked the apartment but still found nothing, so we called the police, but they didn't find any signs of intrusion. In the next few days, I always woke up in the middle of the night, fearing that the weird man would appear again. Tonight, I was woken by some rustling noises, and when I opened my eyes, Will was standing next to me, and he had a knife. I was so scared that I sat up immediately. Will didn't give me a chance to escape. He raised the knife and prepared to stab me. I'm sorry, but I have to do this for her. This was Will's last words. He hadn't any intention of stopping what he was doing. However, his face suddenly twisted as if he was in great pain. Then, his arms were folded behind his back in an extremely exaggerated manner by an invisible force. The knife in his hand also fell to the ground. Only then did I realize that the weird man had appeared again. Will began to burn, but no flame here. His body was just gradually charred in the air, accompanied by the smell of meat being cooked. At last, Will disappeared. Yes, not even a bone was left. Just a pile of ashes on the floor. Mr. Paperbag? I asked the man. He didn't say anything, just took off the paper bag on his head. I finally saw his face. It was burned beyond recognition. I wasn't scared. I just shed tears. Mr. Paperbag was gone. I looked through Will's phone and found out that he had been in love with another girl for a long time. Maybe that's why Will wanted to break up with me, but I cried and begged him not to leave. Recently, they planned to kill me to defraud insurance. I looked up the history of that house in Connecticut, and Google told me that in 1945, a man was disfigured because of the fire caused by his wife and her lover, and he spent the rest of his life alone in that house. My name is Allison Marshall, Alice for short, and I'm not afraid of the dark. I was around 11 to 12 when I found the old teddy bear under my bed. I was drawing and dropped my crayon between the gaps. I got out of bed and grabbed my flashlight, bringing myself down to the ground. I shone the light underneath to find a teddy bear lying next to my crayon. As soon as the light hit it, the bear sat up and looked at me. I gasped and turned the flashlight off while quickly getting back up on my feet. Doubting what I saw, I crouched and pointed the light back to the bear, who once again sat up and stared at me. Being a curious child, I experimented with the bear, who would only move in the light, didn't move at all when in the dark. I remember having little play dates with the teddy bear after my mother would go to sleep, bonding over the following days. Eventually, I adopted my newfound friend as Barry the Bear. There was a particular game Barry liked to play, hide and seek, but instead of hiding to have me find him, Barry would collect certain objects like a doll, a jack-in-the-box, and a symbol monkey. This game of hide and seek followed different rules. I turned the light off to let Barry wander in the dark. I count to 10 and turn the light on. I then make my guess to which toy Barry is currently behind. I pointed at the symbol monkey, to which the jack-in-the-box popped out on its own. Light off then on. I pointed at the doll, to which the monkey started jumping, light off and on. I pointed at the jack-in-the-box, it popped out, and I cheered victoriously. One night, I was too tired to play, so I went straight to sleep. The light in my mother's room came on, and the sound of glass breaking woke me up. I got up and went to check on her. She stood there lifeless. I poked her arm to see if she was okay. She turned her head, revealing a wide, uncanny smile on her face, her eyes completely black. I stepped away and asked if she was alright. She pushed me into the hall and walked over to the drawers. I ran to my room and locked the door. I then sat in the darkest corner of my room and waited. Some time passed and the house was completely silent. I quietly walked towards the door and peeked under it. A kitchen knife came swinging through the gap, sinking directly into my right eye. I screamed in horror and pulled away, my hand on my injured eye as blood rushed out. I used my free hand to open the window, then slid under my bed. I covered my mouth as my mother used the knife to slide past the lock and burst the door wide open. A burning candle was shoved into her mouth as a light source. The wax melted away at her cheeks and chin. She headed to the window, and just as she peeked her head over, I came out from under the bed and pushed her. Her body fell down 4 stories and landed on the trash can below. I looked out the window once, then went to the living room to call 911. They showed up a few minutes later and took me to the hospital. Over the years, I went home to home and eventually grew out of foster care. I now work as a tattoo artist in the downtown area and live in a simple studio apartment. Several doctors offered me glass eyes, but I stuck with an eye patch as a reminder of that night. It took a while to get over my fear of light. I was paranoid for a long time and only stayed in dark areas, taking only the night shifts. But as I grew older, and the more time I had to process, it finally came to me how Barry switched from toy to toy, possessing my mother. It was never the toys or my mother. It was their shadow. I don't know how this happened or what has happened to the real me. All I can do is explain from the beginning and hope someone will believe me. A few days ago, I awoke, but not like any other way I had felt when waking up before. I didn't know where I was. I felt completely different than I ever have, and I don't even remember going to sleep. In fact, the last thing I remember was being at a dinner party. I was trying to make small talk and guzzling down those bacon-wrapped little smokies. My boss has these dinner parties so he can tell us stories and force us to listen. He was in the middle of the one about how he was almost trapped in a cave that collapsed. He was at the part where he says, "We could feel the ground shaking beneath our very own feet, and we could also see the walls cracking with our own eyes." And suddenly a giant... Alan interrupted with the longest fart. The room fell silent. Alan is my coworker and best friend, and he has always had a knack for doing the worst things at the worst times. It's not funny now, but at the time, it was the only funny thing to happen in hours, and when I laughed, a little smoky shot to the back of my throat, and then it all gets kind of hazy from there. I'm just trying to explain the last events I can recall from my normal life, my actual life. Then the next thing I know is I'm waking up, but at first I couldn't open my eyes. I tried to yell for help, but I couldn't open my mouth either. I was trapped in my body, or at least in this moment, I thought it was my body. Suddenly one of my eyes flung open, kind of like blinds being yanked upwards, but the other eye only opened part way. I tried to look around, but I couldn't move them. I still can't really control them, and I tried to turn my head, but my neck was so stiff and inflexible. I couldn't move my head really at all, but I was finally able to force my body upwards to a sitting position. I could see but barely had any control of it. When I realized I couldn't control my eyes, all I could move was my body. I twisted to see around the room and was horrified to find I had no idea where I was, but I was even more horrified when I came upon a mirror. I tried to blink. I strained my eyes, trying to see more clearly. I moved from side to side to see if the image in the mirror moved with me. To my horror, it did. The face, the body I am in, is not me. I'm a person I've never seen, and I look like I'm barely awake. I look like a person that is sleepwalking. I tried to scream. I struggled to barely open my mouth. Then, as the noise finally came out of me, everything in my vision faded. Then, there was nothing. I awoke again, from nothing to a fog that cleared quickly. This time I was on a couch. I felt a sense of urgency, but my motions were clumsy. I swung my body up to get to my feet, and I trudged my way forward toward a door. I made my way down a hallway to a staircase. As I rounded the corner, a woman was coming up the steps. I ran into her. She gasped, then looked at me in a strange way, like confused and concerned and irritated all at once. "Are you all right, Dan?" she asked. "Who the hell is Dan?" "I'm not Dan. I'm not Dan," I screamed in my head, over and over. But this isn't even in my head. I don't belong in this body. Urgh! Was the only noise I managed to get out of this body prison my mind is trapped in. Am I dead? She was horrified. Not only am I unable to speak, but my eyes are only about half open and one of my arms is completely useless, just flailing around. Also, I've just become aware that my mouth has been agape this entire time, and I don't even have enough control of my facial motor skills to close it. I pushed past her and stumbled down the steps and out the door. I stumbled my way along the city street, quickly but swerving from side to side. The lights spread across my entire field of vision and hurt my eyes. People who passed me on the sidewalk have a look of horror on their faces. I stumbled and ran into a group of people, then fell to the ground. That night, the look on their faces was the last thing I saw. When I awoke again, or returned to consciousness, I was on the bed that I was on before. I began to weep. This nightmare won't end. I'm trapped in the body of someone else, a body I barely control. I don't know when I'll fade out or return, or if I'll return. And what happened to my body, my life, the rest of what makes me me? I'm barely anything. I moved to get up out of this bed, frustrated as much as terrified with the reality that I'm trapped, alone, possibly forever. I swung my body up and turned toward the side, but my momentum was yanked back. My arm is tied to part of the backboard of the bed. This is when I was becoming certain that I am in fact sharing this body with someone. I was only tied to one side of the bed, so I moved to that side to untie myself. I began to think about what this man that my mind is occupying must be thinking. I suppose he thinks he is sleepwalking. Is this what it means to possess someone? Is it the case that every time someone is sleepwalking, it's really that they are being temporarily possessed while their mind sleeps? I wonder if he dreams while I take control of his body. I was able to untie myself. Thankfully, my hands are functioning more deliberately. Then I noticed his desk on this side of the room. His laptop was open. So, I've created this account to reach out to anyone who may be able to help me. My real name is Scott Trimple. I live in Worcester, Massachusetts, but I have found out the man I am trapped in is named Daniel Sanderson in Chicago, Illinois. If you can find my best friend, Alan Drames, I know I can prove it is me in here. I hope. I need anyone who can help get me out of here. My consciousness or my soul or whatever it is. Please find out what has happened to my body. You're my only hope. Dan doesn't know about this account. I don't know if I should try to let him know about me or not. How would I react to something this crazy? Anyway, you can contact me here. I don't know when I'll be able to get back. To respond, I'm typing frantically because I can feel myself fading. Please help me. The following is a partial record of incident number 290. I will not disclose my identity or location for the fear of my own safety. I am leaking this because I am obligated to ensure the safety of the human race. The wider public shouldn't be blind to a risk that may result in their deaths. The wider public shouldn't be unprepared and uninformed of the things being done within closed doors. Be ready, be prepared. I wish you the best of luck. The names used in these recordings are pseudonyms and are not the real names of the individuals making these records. Hello, this is Dr. Marcus Laurel. I work for the British Institute. If you were to Google it, you would get various answers on the web, but none of them are the institute I work for. The nature of our work is, to put it frankly, not for the public eye or ear. I make this recording as a record for the British and Iraqi governments exclusively. Our American, Russian, and Chinese counterparts are not yet privy to the specific information I wish to divulge here. I will begin this record with a quick briefing of what we have found. The following information was gathered on the 21st of May 2024. One of our teams that are based in Baghdad, Iraq, was contacted by the British Institute for the Study of Iraq alongside the Iraqi military with concerns that a possible pathogen was released as a result of excavation in an undisclosed location near Baghdad. The inflicted individual, which we will refer to as Patient 0 or Subject 0, was a male 28 years old and holds both British and Iraqi citizenship. The first symptoms were shown almost immediately after leaving the excavation site, after receiving a small cut on his leg from an as of yet unknown source. The initial symptoms were that of a high fever and fatigue. Within 1.5 hours of the initial symptoms, the high fever began to recede, but the feeling of fatigue remained. To outside observers, the subject seemed to have recovered mostly from whatever ailment had struck him, but quickly the subject reported feeling incredibly cold. Upon measuring the body temperature of the subject, they found that he had a temperature of 34 Celsius and started showing signs of hypothermia. Soon thereafter, the subject began experiencing severe and nearly constant seizures, alongside violent muscle spasms. Eyewitnesses also say that the eyes of the subject were bloodshot and that blood vessels on his face and hands became visibly, I quote, swollen, with purple and red coloring. This shows that the subject's blood vessels started to rupture all across his body. Within only a couple of minutes of the seizures and muscle spasms, the subject stopped moving entirely. It seemed he had died, though the parties that had witnessed this could not confirm if the subject was indeed deceased at that moment. They did report that the subject did not breathe and that his skin was cold to the touch. Barely a minute after the aforementioned, the subject again started to have muscle spasms, albeit less severe than before. Following that, the subject got up to his feet with abrupt and stiff movements. The witnesses report that the subject was drooling onto the floor, a mixture of saliva and blood. Shortly thereafter, the subject began to attack the people around him, as if in a blind rage, exhibiting animalistic behavior and with no consideration of his own safety. The subject exhibited increased strength and stamina. The result of these attacks were the death of 2 other individuals, henceforth called Patient 1 and Patient 2, or simply as Subject 1 or 2. The cause of death for both of the subjects came as a result of infected bite wounds on the neck, Patient 1, and right arm, Patient 2. Subject 0 was quickly apprehended and killed by Iraqi law enforcement. Patients 1 and 2 started to experience the same symptoms as Patient 0, but at an accelerated pace. Both subjects began experiencing violent muscle spasms and seizures barely a minute after coming into contact with Patient 0. Shortly thereafter, both subjects got up on their feet, showing the same violent and animalistic behavior as Patient 0. Both subjects were taken down by the Iraqi law enforcement. The Iraqi police report that the subjects barely winced at being shot in the body. One of the subjects were shot 16 times in the torso and once into the head. Only after being shot in the head did the subject cease all movement. The Iraqi military, working alongside our various on-site departments and the World Health Organization, made an off-limits zone around the previous excavation site. All parties involved directly with the incident were put into quarantine for at least a month. The incident has not yet reached any publication, and the wider public is unaware of this incident. We have received all 3 corpses of the subjects for further study. We have yet to isolate the pathogen and determine any effective way to combat it. I will add this comment as a personal note. I think all of you are aware of the fictional concept of a zombie, and this checks all the boxes of a zombie virus, or whatever it may be. We will soon find out, hopefully. If the reports are to be believed, in my professional opinion, I would put this on top of the list for not only national but also global security threats. This is Dr. Marcus Laurel, signing out. Record number 9. Greetings, this is Sean Williams with the British Institute for the Study of Iraq. I have been given this opportunity and, I have been given this information of what had transpired this May on one of the excavation sites in Baghdad. I will not comment on the event itself. I am not an expert in that field. I will leave that to Dr. Laurel, with whom I had spoken at length about the subject previously. I was authorized to continue the excavation on the site where the incident took place, under strict supervision of the Iraqi military and the World Health Organization. I will report the findings that are connected with a previous unfortunate incident where 3 of my colleagues lost their lives. We have uncovered a crypt about 2 or 3 meters underground. Within we have found scrolls that date to the 13th century, written in Greek and Arabic. We have been able to translate some of the texts, while most have interesting insights into the Islamic golden age of the time. One of the texts that relate to the incident dates sometime after 1258 AD, the siege and eventual sacking of the city of Baghdad by the Mongols. The text goes into detail about the 13-day siege, which took place, and the brutality of the event. While we do already know extensively about the event, and the text reiterates much about what we already know, it does speak of an event that we have failed to find in any other record. It speaks about one name, which we have yet to confirm if there is any other mention in any other records. A gentleman named Al-Kahim, which was, according to the text, a sort of polymath and alchemist. It goes into detail about what happened in the days that led up to and during the siege of Baghdad. It says that Caliph of Abbasid Caliphate Al-Mustasim, in his desperation to defend the City of Peace, used a kind of biological warfare to intentionally infect his own citizens with a disease that turned them into the soldiers of Shaitan, into demons. The text describes the way the curse spreads and how it turns people with no consideration of their faith, ethnicity, or status into demonic entities, hell-bent on consuming the flesh of man. The way they describe it all, it is eerily similar to the description of the incident that took place a few months ago. It goes on to say that Al-Mustasim would rather turn Baghdad into rubble than give it to the Mongols. It says that every second inhabitant of the city turned into zombies, and that when the Mongols entered the city, they were massacred. The round walls of the city blocked the hordes from wandering out and spreading any further into the suburbs, though the suburbs too were affected. I should mention that Baghdad during the Islamic Golden Age had a population of almost 2 million at its peak, and if the text is to be believed, half of the population, which is, to our estimate, 600,000 to 1 million people, turned into those things. The text goes on to describe the method by which they managed to destroy them. The aforementioned polymath, Al-Hakim, with the help of some of his apprentices and the Mongols themselves, found out that fire was the most effective way to kill them. They managed to seal off the walls of the inner city and kill off any other demons that managed to get out. Then they set fire to it. They dumped Greek fire into the Tigris River itself and set fire to it as well, so that even if the demons fled into the water, they would either drown or burn. I have sent you a copy of the translation alongside this recording for you to read for yourself. The original text was written in Greek by an unknown author. That is the extent of what I can tell you so far. We have more text we need to translate. Until then, we will continue the further excavation of the site. This was Sean Williams with the British Institute for the Study of Iraq, signing out. End of recording. The ping from the computer in the corner tells me that a new order just came in, which means he will be back soon to cut me open. I can still feel the knife on my skin from the last time. The wounds are long gone, of course, but the memory never seems to fade. You'd think with all the money he has made off of me, he could afford to sedate me properly. He always said there was no reason to bother because he had invested in soundproofing the room. Instead, at least he gave me this phone. Mostly so I could play offline mobile games, because he obviously couldn't let me have internet access, which is why, when I finish writing this, I am going to send it, even if I can't go to anyone yet. That way, if this phone is ever connected to the internet, even by accident, hopefully it will go through, no matter where I am by then. Either way, I should hurry. I don't have long to tell my story. So how did I end up here? Well, I am sure everyone says this, but the whole thing started innocently enough with a car crash. I was 17 at the time, and we were all on our way back from a party. It turned out that the designated driver hadn't been taking their job as seriously as we had expected. I don't remember the accident. Either I had fallen asleep in the car, or my mind just blocked the memory out. I'll never know. But I do remember waking up in the river. The car was upside down, and water was seeping in, slowly filling the space around us. It might sound strange, but I remember my first thought so clearly. Even all these years later, it was, please don't let me die in my shitty hometown. I won't say where I lived exactly. It isn't really important. If you have been to any small town, you know what it was like. It wasn't just that it was boring there with nothing to do in the evenings, but drive out to a field and get drunk with whichever classmates could manage to sneak out that night. It wasn't just that I was a teenager yearning for bigger and better things. After all, I haven't been a teenager for a long time, and I still hate it there. No, it was the people. I am sure they weren't any worse than people anywhere else, but with so few of them present, relatively speaking, it could have been inordinately difficult to find anyone you really meshed with. Sometimes you just had to spend time with anyone you could tolerate and who returned the favor. After the accident, there weren't many of those left for me. I was the only one that survived that night. The paramedics were astounded that I was still alive after so long underwater. They theorized that I must have ended up in some sort of air pocket that kept me breathing until they arrived and pulled the car out. I tried to tell them what had really happened, that I had in fact been breathing in river water for over an hour, feeling myself drowning and dying over and over, but without the blissful darkness to release me. Instead, I would reset back to perfect health, then repeat the process again. Just a functional eternity of agony until rescue came. No one believed me. They chalked it up to a near-death hallucination, and eventually I convinced myself of that too. After all, the alternative was impossible. It took me a long time to come to terms with the fact that I survived when no one else did, but that's not something I want to dwell on here. I've dwelled on it enough in therapy. Regardless, I put the strangeness of that night out of my mind until the next time I died. I was home from university visiting my family over the winter break. I figured that the only stress would be from trying to hide my new tattoo from my mother. The house fire disrupted that a bit. When the firefighters pulled me out of the basement, where I had been trapped by the flames, they told me it was a miracle I had survived. This time I knew for certain that I hadn't. I felt my death, but it couldn't claim me for some reason, and I needed to figure out why. That wasn't a quick process, so I will spare you the details and just summarize what I have learned over the years. The first and most important thing I found out is that everyone gets one and only one request of the universe. The trick is you don't get to decide which of the many requests you will probably make over the course of your lifetime gets granted. It seems to be mostly random. That is why most people don't even notice that this happens, because what they are granted is so small or random that there's no way to tell anything unusual even happened. How many times have you silently wished for a traffic? We make so many tiny inconsequential wishes or requests of the universe that most people's boon ends up being nothing special. Mine was a little different. Basically, I can't die, but only if I'm in my hometown. Yes, I have tested that. It turns out it was sort of a monkey's paw type deal. I got what I wanted, but only that I won't die in my shitty hometown. But the second I leave, all bets are off. I would recommend that people be careful with their wording, but it wasn't like I was even intentionally making a wish, was I? How could I have known? How could anyone? So the whole thing was a bit of a mixed blessing. Immortality might seem like a nice thing to have, but it also meant I was stuck there in the place I hated since I was a child. I could still have left, of course. Realistically, I would have only have been taking the same risk that anyone does when living their life, but how many of you could really walk away from that kind of safety? Whatever you think, you'll never really know until you are faced with the same decision. I used to leave time to time, but whenever anything went wrong, all I could think was, what if I die here, like this? So I left town less and less. Perhaps the irony was intentional. The wish I made because I wanted nothing more than to leave was what kept me there, of my own free will, so I stayed. But since I knew I couldn't die, I began taking greater and greater risks. Perhaps it was to make up for my own cowardice, or perhaps it was simply because I was miserable. I bought a motorcycle that I drove much too fast. I took up base jumping, spelunking, bungee jumping, rock climbing, though the cliffs in town were nothing to write home about. And that was how I met Reese. Reese was part of the admittedly small thrill-seeking community in town. Honestly, he was kind of a dick, but like I said, in small towns, you have to make do with what you've got. At least, he was exciting. People said that he took things too far, that he was reckless, even cruel, but that was what I liked about him. He was interesting. And really, what was he going to do? Kill me? We dated for a while, mostly just casual, but I had fun with him. Maybe a bit too much, because one day I blurted out something I shouldn't have. I told him I couldn't die. He didn't believe me. Of course, who would? He just thought I was drunk, which in fairness I was, or I wouldn't have said anything in the first place. In the sober light of day, I was glad he hadn't believed it and hoped he would just forget the whole thing. Maybe he would have, if it hadn't been for the climbing incident. It was just the two of us up there that day. We were free soloing up a somewhat challenging route that I hadn't tried before, and no one else was crazy enough to join us. Maybe I was trying to impress Reese a bit. I'm not really sure. Whatever the reason, I jumped for a handhold that I couldn't quite reach, and I didn't make it. I fell a long way and landed badly, and I don't mean a broken leg or a sprained shoulder. Badly. I felt my neck hit rock, felt it snap. I knew I had died there. I could always tell when I died, and it just didn't take. This was definitely one of those times. On the upside, it did resolve the cold I had been struggling with for a few days, so silver linings. You see, a few moments after I die, my body simply resets to a state of perfect health, state wiped clean, if it didn't hurt in a way that I can't really even describe. I would probably have used it to cure all my ailments, but I digress. By the time Reese climbed down to me, I was already brushing myself off and preparing a story about how I managed to catch myself a couple of times on the way down. So I really didn't fall that far. I'd hoped his view of my tumble hadn't been very good, but I could tell by the look in his eyes that I hadn't been that lucky. He'd seen everything, and he knew I was lying. Reese didn't call me out on it, though. He acted like everything was normal, and we even continued to see each other. I convinced myself that I had gotten away with it and resolved to be more careful in the future. Then the accident started. The first time it happened, I was just walking up to his apartment when the air conditioner dislodged itself from the window and came hurtling down, landing only inches from me. Reese apologized profusely, saying he was trying to do some repairs and it slipped. But it kept happening. My brakes failed. I got brutal food poisoning whenever he cooked for me. I stepped into the shower to find that the tub had been greased. I probably let it go on longer than I should have, but I assumed it was just bad luck. At first, after all, he would have to be crazy, right? But eventually it was too much, even for me, and I confronted Reese about all the strange accidents that had befallen me recently. At first, he tried to deny it, but eventually he admitted that now he believed that I couldn't die, and he just wanted to see how it worked. What was the harm if he wasn't hurting me? I corrected that misconception pretty quickly. It did hurt to die. It was, in fact, excruciating. Even the ways people usually considered painless, because if you lived, you still had to feel everything reset itself, and that wasn't pleasant. He apologized, saying that he misunderstood and asking for another chance. I agreed, in part because I didn't want him to go blabbing to everyone in town. In reality, that should have been the least of my concerns. There are worse things than gossip, even worse things than death, it turns out. I woke up in the morning after we reconciled to find that I was chained to an operating table. It didn't take long for me to learn why. See, Reese has always been the type of guy who was skilled at using people. It turned out that all that testing and observation was just Reese determining the best way to use me. Once he learned that I retained no lasting damage from any of my fatal injuries, he realized that he could basically use me to print money. After all, I have O-negative blood and a functionally infinite supply of almost any organ you could possibly want. He started a black market online auction site where he sells off healthy organs to the highest bidder. Never too many at once. He didn't want to flood the market, just enough to finance his lifestyle. I am not sure how long I was down in that dingy basement. Months, at least. Maybe a year. Dozens of operations. Months of feeling the exquisite agony of a scalpel slicing through my skin and muscle. Dozens of deaths, and the unfathomable pain that came with them. More than the human mind should have to bear. Physically, I am in perfect health, as fit as the day I woke up in chains. Mentally, well, that is a bit different. It never fades, you see, the feeling of dying. I have wished for real death 1,000 times since that first morning, but you only get one wish, which means that there was only one avenue left open to me. The one I should have taken years ago, before I ever ended up in this situation. I needed to leave my hometown. The idea took way too long to occur to me. In my defense, I haven't been in a great state of mind lately. But eventually it occurred to me that while I had told him I couldn't die, I never mentioned the one string that came attached. So if I could just convince Reese to move me, even just a few kilometers outside of town, then this would finally be all over. It took time. I needed to be careful. If I pushed too hard, tipped my hand, I might never get another opportunity. So I was patient. He had gained a fair amount of wealth by then. I knew, so I began by wondering aloud how he would keep justifying his repeated visits to this shithole. despite the fact he had otherwise relocated to a mansion on the opposite coast. All those trips were bound to look suspicious, wouldn't they? Couple that with his mysterious wealth, absent any legitimate source of income, and some small-town cop was liable to start asking questions, maybe even get a few search warrants. The cops in that town were, for the most part, very bored. They wouldn't be expecting this, of course, but while they were searching for his meth lab, or grow up, they might inadvertently stumble on something that he didn't want them to find. I didn't suggest that he move me. Instead, I suggested he release me before he got caught. He had plenty of money now, didn't he? And it wasn't like I could ever tell anyone what he had done. Who would believe it? I didn't truly think he'd agree, but it couldn't hurt to try. He ignored me at first, but over time I could see that it preyed on his mind. He increased security, started coming less and less often, and when he was there, he was constantly looking over his shoulder. After about a month, he finally made the obvious choice. He had decided to move me to a reinforced bunker he had constructed under his new estate. It would really be for the best, he gloated. No chance the cops would notice if he didn't even have to leave home to go to the bank, as he called it. I had to struggle to hide my smile, and that brings us pretty much up to the present. I arrived at my new accommodations this morning, smuggled over on his private jet. If only I could have at least looked out the window. But of course, they kept a bag over my head the whole time. I wish I had gone out and seen the world while I still had the chance, despite the risks. But hindsight is 20/20, isn't it? I can at least take a little bit of pleasure in the thought that Reese will never understand why it didn't work this time. He deserves worse, of course, but this will have to be enough for me. He'll be down here soon to harvest my lungs or heart or kidneys, and then I won't have to care about him at all anymore. I am looking forward to it. I hope somebody sees this account someday. I'd like to think that someone will eventually know the truth. But even if they don't, that's okay. I got what I really needed in the end. I got out of my hometown. My name is Thomas Reed, and until a few months ago, my life was as ordinary as anyone's. I lived in a modest one-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of the city, close enough to the bustle, but far enough away to escape the noise. I worked as a project manager at a mid-sized tech company downtown. The job paid well, though it wasn't particularly exciting, and the monotony of spreadsheets, meetings, and deadlines had become a comfortable routine for me. My apartment building was old, one of those brick structures from the 1950s that had been converted into modern units, though not without its quirks. Creaking pipes, drafty windows, and the occasional blackout when the power grid strained. I didn't mind the quiet life. Most evenings I'd come home, fix myself a quick dinner, and either watch TV or read. I wasn't much of a socialite, though I had a few friends from work who'd occasionally pull me out for drinks, but for the most part, I enjoyed my solitude. It gave me time to think, to reflect on life, and in many ways, it allowed me to disconnect from the pressures of my job. My neighbor, Miss Granger, was the first sign that something was off about this place. She was an older woman, probably in her late 60s, with thinning gray hair and a hunched posture that made her appear frail, though her sharp eyes suggested otherwise. I would often see her standing in the hallway, staring out of the small window at the end of the corridor as though she were waiting for someone or something. She barely spoke, but when she did, her voice carried an odd, haunting quality. "Be careful in there," she'd said to me once when I first moved in, her eyes fixed on my door as if it hid some terrible secret. I'd laughed it off at the time, thinking she was just a harmless eccentric, but in hindsight, maybe she knew more than she let on. The first time I saw one of them was at work. It was a regular Tuesday afternoon, and I was sitting at my desk, going through a presentation for a meeting later that day. My colleague Marcus had just stopped by to chat about some upcoming deadlines. Marcus was the kind of guy who always had a smile on his face, no matter how stressful things got. He worked in marketing and had an easygoing way about him that made him one of the few people I enjoyed spending time with at the office. "Hey man," Marcus said, leaning against my cubicle. "You still on for that drink later? We could use a break after this week." I was about to respond when I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye. A dark shape, no, a shadow, standing at the far end of the office, just behind the glass partition near the conference room. It was tall, humanoid in shape, but unnaturally still. For a moment, I thought someone from the cleaning crew was standing there, waiting for the meeting to finish. But when I turned my head to get a better look, there was nothing. "What is it?" Marcus asked, following my gaze. "Nothing," I replied, shaking it off. "Just thought I saw someone over there." He shrugged and smiled. "Long week, huh? We should definitely grab that drink." I nodded, still unsettled. The rest of the day passed without incident, though I found myself glancing around the office more frequently, as if expecting to see the shadow again. But it didn't appear, and by the time I left work, I'd convinced myself it had been a trick of the light, a reflection or something. That night, as I sat on my couch, watching the late news, I saw it again. This time, it was in my apartment, standing just outside my bedroom door. My heart skipped a beat and I froze, the remote slipping from my hand and hitting the floor with a dull thud. The figure was barely visible in the dim light of the room, more like a smudge in my peripheral vision, but it was there, unmoving, waiting. I slowly turned my head, trying to get a better look, but as soon as I did, it vanished. I sat there for a long time, staring at the empty hallway, trying to rationalize what I'd just seen. Maybe I was tired, maybe I was imagining things, but deep down I knew that wasn't the case. Something had been there. The next morning, I arrived at the office, feeling more tired than usual. My sleep had been restless, plagued by strange dreams of dark corridors and shadowy figures lurking just out of sight. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, even though I was alone in my apartment. When I sat down at my desk, I tried to focus on work, but my thoughts kept drifting back to the shadow I'd seen the night before. I glanced over at the corner of the office where I'd first spotted it, but everything seemed normal. The usual chatter of keyboards, phones ringing, and quiet conversations filled the air. Still, I couldn't relax. As the day wore on, I found myself becoming more paranoid. Every time I caught a glimpse of movement in the corner of my eye, I would tense up, expecting to see the shadow again. It didn't help that Marcus had noticed my distracted behavior. "You alright, man?" he asked, leaning on the edge of my cubicle. "You've been out of it all day." I forced a smile. "Yeah, just didn't sleep well last night. Weird dreams." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Weird dreams? Maybe you've been working too hard." "Maybe," I muttered, though I knew that wasn't it. Later that afternoon, as I was finishing up some reports, I saw it again. The shadowy figure. This time it was closer, standing at the edge of my desk, just beyond the glow of my computer screen. My breath caught in my throat, and I slowly turned my head, hoping to get a better look without scaring it away. But as soon as I moved, it vanished again, leaving only the faintest hint of something wrong lingering in the air. I pushed my chair back and stood up, my heart racing. I needed to get out of the office. To clear my head, I made an excuse to Marcus about needing fresh air and hurried outside. The streets were bustling with the usual lunchtime crowd, but I felt like I was in a different world, disconnected from the reality around me. The shadowy figure had been so close this time, so real. It wasn't my imagination. Something was following me. That night, I came home feeling more on edge than ever. The shadows were following me everywhere now, at work, in my apartment, even when I went out for a walk. To try and clear my head, they never moved, never spoke, but they were always there, just at the edges of my vision, waiting. I locked the door behind me and collapsed onto the couch, rubbing my temples. I needed to figure out what was happening, but I didn't know where to start. I hadn't mentioned it to anyone. What would I even say? That I was being haunted by shadow people? People would think I'd lost my mind. A knock on my door startled me, and I jumped to my feet. It was late. Too late for visitors, and I rarely had anyone over. For a moment, I thought about ignoring it, but the knock came again. Louder this time. I opened the door to find Miss Granger standing in the hallway, her frail frame casting a long shadow in the dim light of the corridor. Her sharp eyes were fixed on mine, and for the first time since I'd met her, I saw something other than disdain in her gaze. There was concern there, even fear. "You've seen them, haven't you?" she asked, her voice low and urgent. My blood ran cold. "Seen who?" "The shadows," she whispered. "They've been following you." I stared at her, my heart pounding. How could she know? "I've seen them before," Miss Granger continued, stepping closer. "They start small, just at the edges of your vision, but they get closer. They always get closer." "What are they?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She shook her head. "I don't know, but they're dangerous. If you let them, they'll drain you, piece by piece, until there's nothing left." I swallowed hard, fear settling like a heavy weight in my chest. What can I do? Miss Granger's expression darkened. "I don't know if there's anything you can do, but whatever you do, don't acknowledge them. Don't try to confront them. That only makes them stronger." After my conversation with Miss Granger, I knew I couldn't just sit around, waiting for the shadows to consume me. I had to find answers, and if no one else was going to give them to me, I'd have to figure it out myself. I spent the next day researching everything I could about shadow people, paranormal phenomena, and anything remotely connected to what I was experiencing. I scoured online forums, read articles, and even visited the library, hoping to find something, anything that could explain what was happening to me. Most of what I found was inconclusive, a mishmash of urban legends, personal accounts, and pseudoscience. Some people believed shadow figures were ghosts or spirits. Others thought they were interdimensional beings, and a few even claimed they were a form of sleep paralysis. But none of that seemed to match what I was going through. The most unsettling theory I came across was that these shadow figures were entities that fed on life energy. According to some sources, they would latch on to a person, gradually draining their vitality and soul, until the victim was nothing more than a hollow shell. The worst part? Once they had a hold on you, it was nearly impossible to get rid of them. By the time I returned to my apartment, it was already dark, and the familiar sense of dread had settled over me again. The shadows were waiting, as they always were, lingering just out of sight, but I could feel them. They were closer now, pressing in on me from all sides. I sat down at my computer, trying to distract myself with work, but my mind kept drifting back to the shadows. What if Miss Granger was right? What if these things were feeding on me, slowly draining my life away? That night, I had the worst dream of my life. In it, I was standing in the middle of my apartment, but everything was wrong. The walls were twisted, the furniture distorted, and the shadows were everywhere. They surrounded me, pressing in on me so close. I could feel their cold breath on my skin. They didn't move, didn't speak, but their presence was overwhelming. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. I was trapped. In the dream, I reached out to touch one of the shadows, desperate to make sense of what was happening. As soon as my hand made contact, a searing pain shot through my body, and I woke up screaming, drenched in sweat. I sat up in bed, my heart racing. The room still dark around me, but the shadows were there. They were always there now. I could see them, standing at the foot of my bed, watching me. Suddenly, the shadows disappeared, but I couldn't take it anymore. The next day, I called in sick to work. I couldn't focus. Couldn't think about anything but the shadows. I didn't tell Marcus or anyone else what was happening. It wasn't something I could explain over the phone. But I knew I couldn't keep running from this. I had to confront it. I spent the day preparing. I didn't know how to fight these things, but I wasn't going to let them consume me without a fight. I read about different rituals, protective symbols, anything that might help. I wasn't particularly religious, but at this point I was willing to try anything. As night fell, I sat in my apartment, waiting for the shadows to come. I could feel them pressing in on me closer than ever. The room grew colder and the lights flickered, casting long distorted shadows across the walls. This time I didn't look away. I faced them head on, refusing to give in to the fear. They didn't move, didn't speak, but I could feel their presence intensifying, like they were feeding off my energy. For what felt like hours, I sat there staring into the darkness, my heart racing, my hands trembling, but eventually something shifted. The room seemed to grow lighter, the oppressive weight of the shadows lifting, if only slightly. I wasn't free, not yet, but I had faced them, and I was still alive. It's been a week since the shadows first appeared, and they're still with me. They follow me wherever I go, lingering at the edges of my vision, waiting, but they haven't gotten any closer since that night. I don't know how long I can keep this up, but I'm determined not to let them win. Miss Granger was right. They feed on fear, on attention. The more you acknowledge them, the stronger they become. I still see them in my dreams, still feel their cold presence when I'm alone. But I've learned to live with it. I don't know if I'll ever be rid of them completely. But as long as I don't give in, as long as I don't let them consume me, I'll survive. At least that's what I kept telling myself. That night, something felt different. The air in my apartment was colder than usual. Even though it was the middle of summer, it clung to my skin, thick and damp, like the air had taken on a weight of its own. I closed the windows, checked the thermostat, but nothing seemed to make the chill go away. It was as if the walls themselves were exhaling, their cold breath seeping into every corner of the room. The shadows were there as always, hovering at the edges of my vision. Never close enough to touch, but always present. Over the past few days, they had stopped moving closer, but I could sense them lingering just out of sight, waiting for me to slip up. But tonight, it was different. They felt bolder. I sat on the couch, the TV playing some mindless show I wasn't paying attention to. The volume was low, just enough to drown out the silence. My eyes flickered toward the corners of the room, watching for movement, waiting for that familiar sensation of being watched. The shadows were there, lurking, but they felt closer. It wasn't just at the edges of my vision anymore. It was deeper, like they were pressing in on me from all sides, just waiting for me to acknowledge them. I glanced at the clock. 11:45 p.m. 15 minutes until midnight. That was always when they were at their worst, as if the approaching darkness gave them strength. I rubbed my hands together, trying to shake the cold that had settled into my bones, but it was no use. The chill was inside me now. A flicker of movement caught my eye. I turned toward the hallway leading to my bedroom, my breath catching in my throat. There at the far end of the hall was one of the shadows. This time, it wasn't just a smudge in my peripheral vision. It was more solid, more defined. It stood tall, motionless, its form vaguely human but wrong in so many ways. The edges of its body seemed to blur and ripple like smoke, and I could make out no details, just a dark, formless silhouette, standing perfectly still as though it had been waiting for this moment. I froze, my heart pounded in my chest, and for a brief, horrifying moment I thought about running. But where would I go? It would follow me. It always followed me. The shadow didn't move, it just stood there, as though daring me to acknowledge its presence. The tension in the room was unbearable, the silence thick and oppressive. I could feel my muscles tense, every nerve in my body screaming for me to do something, anything, but I couldn't bring myself to move. My mind raced, trying to remember Miss Granger's words. Don't acknowledge them, don't try to confront them. That only makes them stronger. But it was too late. I had seen it, fully seen it, and it wasn't going away. Slowly, the shadow began to shift, its body undulated, rippling like a black mist, and it took a step toward me. I gasped, my heart slamming against my ribs. My breath came in ragged, uneven bursts, and I tried to focus, tried to keep my composure, but the shadow was coming closer now. Deliberately, each movement slow and deliberate. Its presence was suffocating, the air growing thicker with each passing second. I grabbed the remote, turning the volume on the TV up, trying to drown out the silence, trying to break the spell it had over me, but the shadow didn't care. The noise didn't faze it. Another step. I was shaking now, my hands clammy, my chest tight with fear. The lights in the room flickered, casting jagged, twisted shadows across the walls, amplifying the terror in my gut. I told myself to look away, to ignore it, but I couldn't. My gaze was locked on it, and I felt powerless to break free. And then I heard it. A sound, a whisper. No words, just a soft, almost imperceptible murmur like something distant, calling from the depths of a dark cave. The sound was faint, but it sent a cold rush through my veins. A terror so primal that I nearly dropped the remote. The shadow stopped, only a few feet away from me now. My eyes widened, my breath catching in my throat as I realized that it was closer than it had ever been before. I could feel its presence, like a weight pressing down on me, like something draining the very life from my body. My limbs felt heavy, my mind clouded with a fog of fear and confusion. Another whisper, this time closer. I clutched the arms of the couch, my knuckles white, my entire body trembling. The shadow loomed over me now, its form darker than any night I had ever known. I could feel it pulling at me, drawing the energy from me like a black hole, devouring the very air around me. In that moment, something snapped inside me. I had lived with this fear for too long. I had let it control me, dictate every movement, every thought, every second of my life. But I couldn't let it end this way. I couldn't let them win. With a surge of defiance, I pushed myself off the couch and took a step toward the shadow. My heart raced, my entire body on edge, but I didn't stop. I took another step, my breath coming in sharp, shallow gasps, my mind a whirlwind of panic and determination. The shadow didn't move. For a moment I stood there, inches away from it, the cold radiating from its form seeping into my skin. I could feel its presence wrapping around me, suffocating me, draining me of everything I had left. But I didn't back down. "You don't get to take me," I whispered, my voice shaking but firm. The shadow shuddered, its form rippling like smoke in the wind. The lights flickered again, and for a brief moment I thought it might disappear, dissolve into the darkness like it had so many times before. But it didn't. Instead, it retreated. Slowly, its form began to fade, shrinking back toward the hallway, its edges blurring into the shadows that lined the walls. I watched, breathless, as it dissolved into nothingness, leaving behind only the cold, empty silence of my apartment. I stood there for a long time, my heart pounding, my body trembling with exhaustion and fear. The shadow was gone for now, but I knew it wasn't over. It's been a few hours since the shadow retreated, and I haven't seen it again. But the apartment still feels cold, colder than it should. The lights are on. The TV is playing, but it feels like the shadows are watching me from every corner, waiting for the right moment to return. I don't know how much longer I can keep this up. The shadows have been draining me piece by piece, and I can feel it. I'm not the same person I was a week ago. I'm weaker, more tired. The weight of their presence presses on me constantly, even when they're not there. But I'm still here. I haven't given in, and that's something. As I sit here typing this, I can't help but glance at the darkened corners of the room. The shadows are still there, lingering, but they're keeping their distance for now. I don't know if I'll ever be rid of them completely, but as long as I keep fighting, as long as I don't let them consume me, I'll survive. At least I hope I will. For now, that's all I can do. Live with the shadows, face them, and try to hold on to whatever is left of me. Because I know one thing for certain. The shadows never really go away. They're always there, just waiting for the moment when I'm too weak to fight back. And when that moment comes, I'm not sure what will happen, but until then, I'll keep going, even if the shadows are always watching. I'm not sure if this is the best place to post this. There will probably be a lot of YTA comments, but let me be a cautionary tale against being a good Samaritan and helping strangers with luggage. And while I know my actions will probably disgust a lot of people, before you criticize, I want you to think, really think, if you do anything different than me. So I was at airport baggage claim when a woman asked me to watch her bag. "Promise you'll keep this for me until I get back," she said. I promised her I'd look after it, laughing a little because she seemed so anxious, as if she was worried I'd abandon it and leave it for someone to steal. The woman thanked me profusely and left, presumably to pee. I thought, given how quick she went. She never came back. The bag had no tag and no name, just a ribbon tied on the handle. I kept it with me and waited a whole half hour for her return, but after 45 minutes, well, this was ridiculous. I left the suitcase with the rest of the unclaimed luggage, figuring it would find its way to her eventually. I was wrong. When I got home, the suitcase was there in the entryway. I stared as I closed the front door behind me. Weird, right? How did it get here? Vague thoughts flitted through my head that the airport somehow delivered it. Maybe they saw me sitting with it and assumed it was mine. The suitcase was a dark gray-green, one of those big clamshell ones with sturdy fabric around the zipper, a lacy ribbon tied on the handle, and no labels at all. Not even a flight barcode sticker. Next day, I returned it to the airport. But when I got home, it was back in my house. This was getting disturbing. Who'd brought it back here? How did they know where I lived? If this was a prank, it had gone too far. I grabbed the suitcase and wheeled it out to the dumpster in the alley and tossed it in. But a few hours later, it was back. By then, I'd unpacked for my trip, and my own luggage was deep in my closet. The green suitcase was just sitting there, as if waiting to be unpacked also. I drove it out to a dumpster across town. It was back when I got home. I took it to Goodwill and donated it, but it returned again. Each time it got back, it felt heavier. As the days passed, I started having nightmares about the suitcase. I'd close my eyes, and as soon as I was asleep, I'd feel the clamshell around me, as if I were all folded into it. My limbs scrunched, my lungs suffocating. I tried to breathe, but the air was stale, and I was smothered. Finally, I'd panic and wake up, and see the suitcase in my room. In addition to getting heavier, it was also getting stinkier. At first, I thought it was from being thrown into the dumpster, but no, this was a different odor, and it got worse over time. It reeked like someone had hunted a deer and packed it in there and left it, and it leaked. A sort of foul dark liquid that dripped into the carpet and left a stain. I decided to change tactics and video the suitcase in hopes of catching whoever kept returning it to me. My parents had a pet cam for their dogs, so I asked them to take care of the suitcase for me, and I made sure to place it in their living room in sight of the camera so that when it disappeared, I'd be able to pinpoint how and when. A day passed, too. When I checked the footage of my parents' pet cam, The suitcase was still there. Then they called me up. Would I take my suitcase back? It was taking up space and stinking up their living room. I retrieved the suitcase and back at home, put it in the garage and installed a camera to monitor it. It stayed in the garage, thank goodness, because the smell was truly god-awful. But my dreams got even more disturbing. In the latest one, I wasn't able to move at all. I could feel my skin beginning to slow off, my eyes melting in my head, maggots crawling through my rotting flesh. When I woke up, it took me a few moments to blink bleary eyes and realize where I was. I was standing in the door to the garage, sleepwalking, apparently, on my way toward the suitcase. A sudden dread seized me. I was afraid to go near it, to even touch it, certain that if I unzipped it, I'd wind up inside. I rented a hotel room, but of course it followed me there. At work, my boss swung by my desk to ask if everything was alright. She'd notice my declining mental state. I broke down and I confessed everything. She asked me what was in the suitcase. I don't know, I stammered. It's not mine. I never looked. You never even looked? She seemed stunned. Isn't that the first thing you should have done? It seemed logical when she said it, but right now, even the idea of opening it all but suffocated me with dread. She said she'd like to see this mysterious suitcase and asked me to show her after work. We drove together to my hotel room. On the way, she theorized what might be in there. Was I being framed? Was there a body? I should have called the police right away, she said. Or was it something more mundane? Maybe someone bought me a frozen turkey and it had thawed and was becoming nasty. Maybe a family member was pranking me. Could be anything. And I'd know already if I'd opened the thing. My leaving the mystery for so many days seemed ridiculous to her. I had to agree, but nothing in the world would make me touch that zipper. The suitcase was there, waiting right by the door when we walked in, just tucked to one side like it was ready for me to open it. The entire room stank. My boss wrinkled her nose and even she looked a little hesitant. She told me to open it, but I shook my head and made a noise in my throat. And she sighed and rolled her eyes and said, "All right, shut the door. We don't want anyone walking by to see." She rolled it into the bathroom in case it was messy and said she'd just open a little, take a peek. "Where did you say it came from again?" she asked as she tugged on the zipper. I backed away, sitting on one of the beds so there was some distance between me and the bathroom. I couldn't see her anymore, but I just didn't want to be near when she unzipped it. "Someone at the airport asked me to watch it," I said. "Actually, it's funny. The only time it didn't return was when I asked my parents to look after it. It stayed put for a couple of days. I wonder if..." I stopped, because why wasn't she saying anything? "Are you looking inside?" I called. Silence. Dread swirled in my belly. All my limbs felt leaden. I called out again. "Did you unzip it? Did you peek inside yet?" A faint muffled sound. The fear was a stone in the pit of my stomach. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Then I heard again what seemed like a smothered cry. I rushed to the bathroom and gasped. The tip of a polished loafer sank into the suitcase, which bulged and trembled, and then the shoe was gone, and the zipper was like lips smacking shut. The suitcase sat, just a suitcase. After that, I took the suitcase with me to the bus and train terminal downtown. It was now lightweight with a slight musty smell. I surveyed the station. There was a woman with small children, a father with a teenager in tow, and then I spotted a leathery-faced man in a bucket hat sitting alone on one of the metal chairs, looking a bit worse for wear. I approached him and sat next to him, pretending to read for a few moments, and then I turned to him. "Excuse me, sir," I said. Would you mind watching my bag for me for a bit? He looked up at me, surprised, but mumbled, "Sure. You won't leave it sitting here, will you? Promise me you'll hold on to it until I get back," I insisted. "Yeah, sure, no biggie." "Thanks a million," I told him. Then I left. I haven't been back. I'm under investigation for my boss's disappearance since she was last seen in my car, but the nightmares have stopped. The smell is gone. You probably think I'm terrible, but ask yourself honestly, what would you have done in my situation? I have to issue this warning so that I can prevent others from suffering the same experience. If someone asks you to watch their bag, don't do it, no matter how much social etiquette compels you to smile and agree. Make an excuse and leave. Let people look after their own luggage. I know I'm never watching anyone's bag again. The drive into town was uneventful, but the isolation of the countryside pressed on me more with every passing mile. I had taken the assignment from the magazine on a whim, looking for something different from the usual fast-paced urban reporting. A remote farming town in the middle of nowhere seemed like a good way to unwind, or so I thought. I didn't anticipate that the silence would have such a weight to it. I'd been a journalist for over a decade, mostly covering political scandals, city crime, and occasionally dipping my toes into feature stories that offered a respite from the chaos. This time, it was something altogether different. I was set to investigate the strange customs and superstitions of this remote town that most people had never even heard of. The road leading into the town was long and narrow, cutting through endless fields of corn. The stalks stretched toward the sky, their tops swaying gently in the breeze. I rolled down the car window to let in some fresh air, but the scent was strange, not the sweet, earthy smell of crops, but something metallic and faintly sour. I tried to ignore it as the first few houses of the town came into view. It was nearing dusk when I pulled into what passed for the town square. A handful of buildings, a grocery store, a diner, and a post office lined the street, each one as weathered and tired as the others. The streets were empty, the place almost ghostly quiet. I parked the car outside a small worn-down inn. According to the research I'd done before arriving, this was the only place in town that rented rooms to outsiders. The innkeeper, a woman in her 60s with deep-set wrinkles and a permanent frown, greeted me at the front desk with a glance that felt more like a warning. "You're the journalist?" she asked, her voice gravelly and low. "That's right," I said, giving her a nod as I handed over my ID. "I'm here for a week, working on a piece about local folklore, strange customs, superstitions, that kind of thing." The innkeeper's eyes narrowed. "Folklore, huh? You be careful about poking around too much. Some things are better left alone." Her words struck me as odd, but I didn't dwell on them. I chalked it up to small-town superstition. I dealt with people who believed in far stranger things before. After checking in, I grabbed my bag and headed up to my room, promising myself I'd get an early start on interviews the next day. The room was small and musty, but it had everything I needed. A single window looked out over the cornfields that bordered the town as the sun set, casting long shadows across the fields. I stood by the window and watched as the wind made the cornstalks sway like waves on a dark sea. Something about the view made me feel uneasy. The isolation, perhaps, or the overwhelming quiet. I closed the curtains and decided to get some sleep. That night, I dreamt of voices. They were faint, almost whispers, carried on a breeze that seemed to drift through my open window. In the dream, I was walking through the cornfields, the stalks towering over me on either side. The voices grew louder as I moved deeper into the fields, beckoning me, calling my name. I woke with a start, my heart pounding in my chest. The room was pitch dark, the silence oppressive. I glanced toward the window, but it was still closed. I could have sworn I heard someone whisper my name just before I woke, but there was no one here. I chalked it up to a vivid dream and tried to settle back into sleep. The next morning, I began my work. I spent most of the day speaking with the locals, farmers, store owners, and the few families who had lived in the town for generations. Everyone was polite enough, but there was a common thread in their responses, a reluctance to talk about the town's history or the strange customs I was here to investigate. I brought up the cornfields a few times, hoping to steer the conversation toward the topic of the strange rumors I had heard before arriving, rumors about the listeners and the town's peculiar rule about silence after nightfall, but most people brushed it off or outright refused to engage. An older man at the diner who introduced himself as Bill was the only one willing to talk, though he didn't say much. "You're not from here," Bill said, stirring his coffee absently. "You'll find things a little different in this town. Folks don't talk much about the fields. It's safer that way." "Safer how?" I pressed, hoping for more details. Bill's gaze shifted towards the window, where the cornfield stretched out toward the horizon. "There are things you hear in the fields," he said quietly. "Things you shouldn't listen to." "Like what?" I asked, leaning forward. Bill didn't answer right away. He took a sip of his coffee, his eyes still fixed on the distant corn. "Just don't speak near the fields at night," he finally said. "And if you hear voices on the wind, pretend you didn't." That was as much as I could get from him. The rest of the townspeople were even more tight-lipped. I spent the rest of the day wandering the outskirts of the town, taking notes and snapping photos for the article. But something about the place left me feeling off. It was too quiet, too still, the kind of place where you expect to hear birds or insects, but there was nothing, just the constant rustling of the cornfields. As evening approached, I returned to the inn. The sun was setting, casting long, distorted shadows across the town, and a cold wind had picked up. I stood by the window in my room, looking out at the darkening fields. I couldn't help but think about what Bill had said. Don't speak near the fields at night. That night, after a quiet dinner in the town's small diner, I found myself back in the inn, sitting at the window watching the dark fall over the fields again. There was something about the wind here, something that made me feel like I wasn't alone, even though I couldn't see anyone out there. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting just beyond the fields, watching, listening. I glanced at my notes from the day. Bill's warning about not speaking near the fields had lodged itself in my mind. As far as superstitions go, it wasn't the strangest I'd encountered, but the way the townspeople avoided the subject made it feel more serious. And then there was that strange quiet, the way the wind carried no sound, but its own. It was as if the entire town held its breath once the sun went down. I flipped through my notebook, considering the interviews. Most of what I'd gotten was vague, non-committal responses from the locals. People who, by all appearances, just wanted me to leave them and their strange customs alone. But I wasn't about to leave without getting to the bottom of whatever was going on here. A sudden gust of wind rattled the window, pulling my attention back outside. The cornfields swayed in the distance, their tops bending in unison as the wind passed through. The longer I stared, the more I felt like I could see shapes moving between the rows. Just shadows, I told myself, but there was something about the way the darkness clung to those fields that made me uneasy. I glanced at the clock on the wall. It was nearing midnight. Before I could talk myself out of it, I grabbed my jacket and my notebook, determined to investigate. If there was something about the night that brought out the superstition in these people, I wanted to see it for myself. And if I was honest with myself, part of me didn't fully believe any of it. After all, it was just a field. I left the inn quietly, not wanting to alert the innkeeper. Outside, the wind had picked up, making the night feel colder than it should have been for early autumn. I zipped up my jacket and headed toward the fields. The streets were deserted, and the silence of the town felt more oppressive than usual. The cornfields loomed ahead, their stalks swaying gently in the wind, making the only sound in an otherwise dead night. As I neared the edge of the fields, I slowed my pace, feeling a knot of tension form in my chest. There was nothing to fear out here. The listeners, if they even existed, were just a story passed down by the townspeople, a way to explain away the strangeness of the place. Still, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I approached the field. The rule was simple: don't speak near the field at night. But that rule was for the locals. I wasn't one of them. I stopped at the edge of the field, the wind whispering through the corn. It was almost inviting, as if the field itself was calling me to step closer, to listen. For a long moment, I stood there in silence, listening to the wind. Then, without thinking, I spoke. "Is anyone out there?" The words barely left my lips before the wind seemed to shift. The rustling of the corn stalks stopped abruptly, leaving an unsettling stillness in its wake. My heart quickened as I scanned the rows of corn, half expecting someone or something to emerge from the darkness. There was no response, no movement, just silence. I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding, feeling a bit ridiculous for letting the stories get to me. I turned to leave, but as soon as I took a step, I heard it. A voice, soft, distant, but unmistakable. "Help me." I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The voice had come from the field, from somewhere deep within the rows of corn. It was faint, almost lost on the wind, but it was there. I turned back toward the field, squinting into the darkness, trying to see if someone was out there. The voice came again, this time clear. "Please, help me." It was a woman's voice, fragile, desperate, against every instinct telling me to walk away. I took a step closer to the field, then another. The corn stalks swayed gently as I approached, as if they were waiting for me to come closer. "Where are you?" I called, my voice trembling slightly. The words felt heavy in the stillness, like they didn't belong out here. There was a pause. Then the voice answered. In the field. I'm lost. I hesitated at the edge of the field, my hands trembling. Everything in me screamed to turn back, to go back to the inn and forget this ever happened. But the voice, it sounded so real, so human. I stepped into the field. The corn stalks closed in around me, their dry leaves brushing against my arms and face. As I moved deeper into the rows, the farther I went, the harder it was to see anything. The wind had died down completely, leaving an eerie, unnatural silence in its place. Where are you? I called again, my voice barely more than a whisper. I'm here. The voice came again, closer this time, just a little further. I pushed forward, my heart pounding in my ears. The cornstalk seemed to stretch on forever, endless rows of tall, looming figures that swayed gently in the darkness. I had no idea how far I'd gone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something was moving just beyond my field of vision, hiding among the corn. Then suddenly, the voice was right beside me. Over here. I whipped around, my breath catching in my throat. The voice had been so close, but there was no one there, just the endless rows of corn, their shadows stretching long and dark in the faint moonlight. Panic rose in my chest, and I stumbled backward, my hands brushing against the rough stalks. I turned to leave, but before I could take another step, I heard it again. This time, it was my voice. Where are you? The moment I heard my own voice echoing back at me from somewhere deep in the field, my blood ran cold. The exact cadence of my words, the tremor of unease I hadn't realized was there, all of it mirrored back at me with eerie precision. I stood frozen for what felt like an eternity, listening to the rustling corn, waiting for something, anything to emerge. But all I heard was silence, and yet that voice. My voice had come from somewhere within the stalks. I started backing away, my eyes scanning the rows for movement, my mind racing to make sense of what had just happened. As much as I wanted to explain it away, to chalk it up to an overactive imagination or some trick of the wind, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been lured into that field, that whatever was out there wanted me to follow it, to come closer. No, I had to get out of here. I turned and hurried back toward the edge of the field, pushing through the stalks, my heart pounding in my ears. The rows seemed longer now, as if the field had grown while I was inside. The way out should have been just ahead, but the more I pushed forward, the more disoriented I became. The corn closed in around me, the darkness deepening, the whispers fading in and out of earshot, too faint to catch, but always just beyond reach. Help me, a voice barely audible, whispered from behind. I stopped in my tracks, every muscle tensed, my breath hitched. It was my voice again. Please, help me. I forced myself not to turn around, not to acknowledge it. I picked up my pace, nearly tripping over the thick roots and dry soil beneath me. It felt like the field was swallowing me whole. The more I tried to escape, the more the corn seemed to tighten its grip around me. The wind had picked up again, and with it came more voices, faint, indistinguishable, but all of them carried a tone of familiarity, like they had once belonged to someone I knew. Don't leave us. I pushed harder, breaking into a run now, the stalks whipping against my face and arms. My mind raced, my pulse drumming in my throat. The voices were growing louder, more insistent, calling from all directions. Suddenly, the ground beneath me shifted. My foot caught on something. A thick root, or maybe an old furrow in the field. I went down hard. The wind knocked out of me as I hit the earth. The whispers closed in around me, the wind swirling faster through the corn. I lay there for a moment, gasping for a breath, feeling the pull of the darkness behind me, urging me to turn around. I scrambled to my feet, ignoring the pain in my ankle, and stumbled forward. And then, as suddenly as it had all begun, I broke free. I stumbled out of the field and onto the road. The tall stalks of corn swaying behind me like a living wall. My chest heaved with exhaustion and fear. I turned back, staring at the field in disbelief. The whispers were gone, the air unnervingly still. It was as if the field had returned to normal, as if nothing had happened at all. But something had happened. I wasn't imagining this. My hand instinctively went to my throat, feeling for something I couldn't name. Something out of place. For a moment, I thought I could feel a faint scratch, like a jagged scar barely healed. But when I looked down, there was nothing. No mark. Just my own skin, clammy with sweat. I backed away from the field, my mind reeling. What was happening here? I made it back to the inn in a daze, my legs trembling with every step. The streets were still empty, the town silent as ever. Not a soul stirred, not even at the diner across the street. I slipped inside the inn, my footsteps sounding too loud in the quiet of the lobby. The innkeeper was nowhere to be seen, and for that, I was grateful. I didn't want to explain where I had been, or why I looked like I had seen a ghost. In my room, I locked the door behind me. My hands shaking as I twisted the deadbolt into place. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of everything that had happened. But the more I thought about it, the more fragmented it became. Had I really heard those voices? Had I really been lured into that field? I needed to leave. I wasn't safe here, whatever was in those fields. It wasn't human. And the more time I spent in this town, the more I felt like it was pulling me closer to something I couldn't understand. Something that wanted to trap me. I collapsed onto the bed, exhaustion overtaking me, but sleep didn't come easily. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the whispers again, calling my name, echoing in my own voice. The next day, I woke to a weak gray light filtering through the thin curtains of my room. The town felt different now, less oppressive, but also more hollow, like I was walking through a shell of a place that had long since given up its secrets. I couldn't shake the events of the night before, and despite every instinct telling me to pack up and leave, I needed answers. I had to know what was happening in this town, why the fields seemed to be alive with something otherworldly, and why no one would talk about it. At breakfast, I spotted Bill, the man who had first told me about the rule of silence near the fields. He was sitting alone at a corner table, staring into his coffee, like the weight of the world rested on his shoulders. I approached cautiously, not wanting to startle him. "Bill," I said softly. He looked up. His eyes were wary but alert. "You're still here," he said, as if he had expected me to be gone by now. "You didn't listen, did you?" I hesitated, then shook my head. "I went to the fields last night. I heard something." His face paled. and he leaned in closer, his voice barely above a whisper. You heard them, didn't you? The listeners. What are they? I asked, my voice just as quiet. Bill glanced around the diner, as if making sure no one else was listening. They've been here for as long as anyone can remember, he said. We don't know where they come from, or what they want, but we know they're always listening. They take your voice, your words, and use them against you, and once they've had a hold on you, there's no escaping. I felt a chill run down my spine. But why me? Why now? Bill shook his head. They target anyone who doesn't follow the rules. You spoke near the fields at night, didn't you? I nodded, feeling a knot tighten in my stomach. That's how they find you, he repeated, his voice softer now, almost a whisper. Once you speak, they latch on, they mimic you, lure you in, and before you know it, you're lost. Just like the others. The weight of his words settled on me like a heavy fog, thick and inescapable. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us, something just beyond the walls of the diner. I wanted to ask more, but the old man's eyes told me enough. This was a truth he had carried for years, one that had hollowed him out from the inside. Did anyone ever make it back? I asked, barely able to bring myself to form the words. He shifted in his seat, rubbing his fingers together like he was holding something invisible, something fragile, a few. But they weren't the same when they came back, not really. The listeners, they take something from you, even if you manage to get away. He pointed to his own throat, and for the first time I noticed the thin jagged scar running along his skin, a mark that had faded with time but not with memory. They leave their mark on you. Your voice isn't your own anymore, and sometimes even your thoughts, they're not yours either. A chill ran through me, the kind that seeps into your bones. What do you mean? They change you. Some people come back, and they don't speak at all, as if they're afraid their own words will betray them. Others speak, but their voices sound hollow, like echoes of what they once were. You can hear it in their tone, that emptiness, and some. He trailed off, his eyes darkening as if remembering something too painful to say aloud. Some listen to the wind as if they're waiting for something, waiting to be called back. I swallowed hard, trying to process what he was telling me. The wind outside seemed to pick up, rattling the windows of the diner. But why them? Why does this happen? He gave a bitter laugh. That's the question, isn't it? Why anyone? Maybe it's punishment. Maybe it's just bad luck. The listeners have been around longer than the town itself, some say. They come with the fields, and when the fields grow, so does their reach. The fields, I muttered, thinking about the endless rows of corn stretching beyond the town. Are they getting closer? The old man's face twisted in a grimace. You've noticed, haven't you? Every year they creep a little closer. The fields used to be further out, but now they're right up against the edge of the town. The listeners are expanding their territory, little by little, and no one says anything about it? I asked, incredulous. They're too scared, he said simply. No one wants to admit it, but everyone knows. That's why they follow the rules, why they stay silent at night, why they don't stray too close to the fields. It's like they think if they pretend it's not happening, it won't reach them, but it will, eventually. It always does. I felt the air grow heavier, as if the diner itself was holding its breath. The thought of the fields growing, slowly creeping toward the town like a living thing, filled me with a deep, gnawing dread. Is there any way to stop it? I asked, though part of me already knew the answer. The old man looked at me with sad, tired eyes. I don't think so. Once the listeners have marked you, they don't let go. And the town, it's been theirs for a long time now. We're just living in their shadow. I sat back in my chair, the reality of the situation sinking in. The fields were growing, the listeners were getting closer, and it felt like there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. The silence between us stretched out, punctuated only by the occasional gust of wind outside. The old man stared out the window, lost in his own thoughts, while I tried to make sense of everything he had told me. How do you live with it? I finally asked. How do you stay here, knowing what's out there? He shrugged. You get used to it, I suppose. You learn the rules, and you keep your head down. It's not much of a life, but it's better than being out there with them. He paused, his gaze far away. Besides, leaving isn't as easy as you think. Once you're marked, it follows you. The voices, the wind. It doesn't stop just because you run. I didn't have an answer to that. What could I say? The town was a prison, but the outside world was no escape. I finished my coffee, the bitter taste lingering on my tongue. Thanks for the warning, I said, though I wasn't sure it would make any difference. I'll be careful. He nodded, his expression solemn. I hope so, but be careful about one thing, kid. Once you've heard them, they don't forget you. The old man's words echoed in my mind as I left the diner. Outside, the wind had died down, but the air was still thick with an oppressive silence, the pale light of the morning sun weak against the gray sky. But the town, the fields, it all felt wrong, too quiet, too still. The faint rustling of the corn felt intentional, deliberate, like the fields were breathing, waiting. I took a deep breath, trying to shake the unease that clung to me like a second skin. It was just corn, I told myself, but my feet still moved a little quicker as I walked back to my car. I started the engine, the low hum giving me a momentary sense of normalcy. I glanced at the dashboard clock. It was only 8:30 in the morning. The sun had barely risen, but already it felt like it had been swallowed by the grayness around me. There was no warmth in the light, no comfort in the day. As I drove back through town, I passed a few people on the street, locals going about their daily business, but no one spoke, not even a wave or a nod. Their eyes flickered to me, then quickly away, as if acknowledging my presence would somehow invite something unwanted. I was beginning to understand the unspoken rules of this place. You didn't speak after dark, and in the daylight, you simply acted like the night never happened. I should have left. Every instinct told me to pack up and drive far from here. But I couldn't, not yet. There was still something pulling at me, something unfinished. I made it back to my room, at the small inn I'd been staying at. The room felt stuffy, the air heavy with a faint mildew scent that clung to everything. I opened the window to let in some fresh air, but the view outside didn't bring any relief. The cornfields stretched out in the distance, dark and looming, and they were closer than I remembered. I froze. Was that my imagination? The fields seemed to have crept closer to the town, like they'd swallowed up the distance overnight. I blinked, trying to clear my mind. Maybe it was just the angle, or maybe I was overthinking everything. I needed to stay calm, but calm wasn't an option. As the hours passed, I couldn't stop glancing out the window. The fields remained there, unmoving, but somehow alive, their dark tendrils curling at the edges of my vision. I tried to distract myself, reading, jotting down notes from the old man's story, anything to keep my mind from drifting back to the fields. But no matter what I did, the pool was there, like an itch at the back of my skull. The day dragged on, each minute a weight pressing down on me. I watched the light shift from pale morning gray to the dull orange of late afternoon, and my nerves frayed with every passing hour. The townsfolk had retreated into their homes by now, their doors firmly shut, their curtains drawn. No one wanted to be outside when the night came, and yet I stayed. By the time the sky began to darken, the air felt thick with anticipation. I could hear it now, the faint rhythmic rustling of the cornfields in the distance, like the sound of 1,000 whispers carried on the wind. It was almost soothing, if it wasn't for the undercurrent of malice, like those whispers were directed at me. I checked the clock, 6:45 p.m. Sunset was coming. I paced around the room, trying to make a decision. Stay? Leave? Something inside me screamed to leave before nightfall, but curiosity kept me anchored. I felt like I was standing on the edge of something vast and terrible, and part of me needed to know what was out there. As the last rays of sunlight faded, the shadows lengthened, creeping across the town like a living thing. And then, in the silence, I heard it. Voices, soft at first, carried on the faint breeze that swept through the open window. At first, they were unintelligible murmurs, just a whisper in the background. But as the night deepened, they became clear, louder, familiar. My breath caught in my throat as I realized what I was hearing. The voices weren't just random whispers, they were mine. My voice calling out into the night, repeating things I'd never said. I rushed to the window, staring out at the dark fields. And then I saw them. Figures moving through the corn. Tall, thin shapes barely visible in the darkness. Their forms swaying in time with the wind. They moved like shadows, slipping between the stalks, their faces obscured by the night. But the voices were everywhere, and they weren't just mine anymore. I slammed the window shut, backing away from the sight. My heart pounded in my chest, and a cold sweat slicked my skin. I had to get out of here. I grabbed my keys and ran out the door, my footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. The inn was silent, abandoned, as if everyone else had already fled. When I reached my car, I could still hear the whispers on the wind. They surrounded me, filled the air, pressing in from all sides. I jumped into the driver's seat and turned the key, the engine sputtering to life. I floored the gas, speeding out of the parking lot, desperate to escape. But as I drove through the empty streets, the cornfields seemed to follow me. Every road, every turn led me back to the same dark horizon, the same swaying stalks. It was like the fields were closing in, swallowing the town inch by inch. The voices never stopped, never faded, and then, up ahead, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The road ended, swallowed by the corn. The fields had overtaken the outskirts. Pushing into the town itself, there was no escape. The listeners were coming. I slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a stop, just inches from the edge of the field. The stalks swayed in the darkness, and for a moment I thought I saw figures standing just beyond the edge, watching me. I had to get out of here, but there was nowhere left to run. I sat in the car, my hands gripping the wheel, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The whispers were louder now, filling the air, echoing inside my head, my voice calling out from the fields, telling me to come closer, telling me to listen. And then, as the last light of day vanished, I heard it, the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate footsteps, coming from the cornfields. The figures were moving closer, stepping out from the shadows, their shapes barely visible in the darkness. I couldn't see their faces, but I knew they were looking at me. I couldn't stay, I couldn't leave. The listeners had found me. I turned the key in the ignition, praying the car would start. The engine roared to life, and I floored the gas, driving straight toward the cornfields, the road swallowed by the darkness ahead. The figures vanished into the night, and the whisper grew louder, filling the air with their eerie, hollow sound. But I kept driving faster and faster, until the world around me blurred into a haze of shadows and sound. The voices were everywhere now, inside my head, in the wind, in the fields. They called my name over and over, pulling me closer. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The road opened up before me, the fields falling away. The town was gone. The whispers faded into nothing, leaving only the sound of my own breathing in the silence. I had escaped. I had been working at the call center for just under a month, my shift starting at midnight and running until the sun peeked through the horizon. The job was simple enough: handle customer queries, maintain the script, and keep the calls flowing. But there was something about those late-night shifts that felt off. The office was quiet, too quiet. The only sound was the low hum of computer monitors and the occasional creak of the building settling. It was the kind of silence that made every small noise seem unnervingly loud. But with all those subtleties, I badly needed the money to save up for my wedding. My fiancé and I aren't getting younger, you see. Met in our late 20s. We spent almost 3 years traveling all of Asia. Just this year, we decided to finally get married and settle down. That motivated me to find a second job, and it eventually landed me in this call center, as the schedule is very flexible and pay was fair for where I was located. Last night, something happened that I still can't fully explain. It started with a whisper of a rumor that had been circulating among the older agents. They spoke of a worker who had died at their desk months ago, supposedly of a heart attack. The story was always told in hushed tones, like it was a secret too dark to be spoken aloud. I tried to shake off the unease, but it lingered like a cold draft. As I settled into my desk, I noticed an unusually cold chill in the air. The office's air conditioning was always set to an uncomfortable low, but tonight it felt different, more biting, more invasive. I brushed it off, attributing it to my tiredness. Around 3 a.m., when the office was at its emptiest, I took a short break. I stepped out of the cubicle to grab a cup of coffee from the break room, a small reprieve from the endless cycle of calls. The hallway was dimly lit, the flickering fluorescent lights casting strange shadows on the walls. It was then that I saw something unsettling. There, in the corner of the hallway, was an old photograph taped to the wall. It was worn and yellowed with age, the edges curling up. I approached it hesitantly, my heart pounding in my chest. The photograph depicted a group of call center employees from years ago. I recognized a few faces, but one stood out. A woman with hollow eyes and an unsettling wide smile. I tried to dismiss it as a prank or an old piece of office decor, but as I returned to my desk, a shiver ran down my spine. The temperature in the room had dropped even further, and the low hum of the air conditioning seemed to have intensified. Now a low, almost imperceptible growl. The calls became erratic too. Every now and then, a call would come through with nothing but static on the line. But it wasn't just static. It was accompanied by a low, mournful wail that seemed to come from the depths of the earth. I could almost hear the faint echoes of a heartbeat pounding in the background. As the night dragged on, my fatigue began to set in. My eyes grew heavy, and I struggled to keep them open. At one point, I looked up from my screen and saw her, the woman from the photograph, standing at the dark corner of the room. Only her head down to her chest was illuminated slightly. She wasn't in the photograph anymore. She was real, her black and hollow eyes fixated on me with an empty, soulless gaze. They appeared hollow to me, but I felt that she was directly staring at me. To add to the horror, she seemed to be grinning from chin to chin, not trying to be silly, but at that moment, I randomly thought she smiled like Jim Carrey's The Grinch, only in a sinister way, with a strong and potent evil intent. Funny how my brain works in this type of moment. In her eyes was a look of madness and deep sadness at the same time, somewhat asking the question, why me? It was the oddest spectacle to see, a weird mix of emotions in the way she stared at me. The wails she produced sounded diabolical, a cacophony of crying and giggling, but ended with harsh crying. I assumed maybe she died confused and had no time to process that she's gone, forever stuck in a state of illness with no way to escape. A cruel fate, I must say. I rubbed my eyes, blinking furiously to clear the image. When I looked again, she was gone from the spot where the light illuminated. But the feeling of being watched remained, as though her gaze was still burning into my back. The image of those hollow eyes will forever be etched into my brain. How it stared at me, how it terrified me, how it will horrify my unborn children. Around 5 a.m., just as the first light of dawn began to seep into the office, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A fellow agent, one who had been working the same shift as me, was slumped over at his desk. His face was pale, and his breathing was shallow. I rushed over, my heart pounding, only to find that he was lifeless. A cold sweat broke out on my forehead as I realized he had suffered a heart attack, just like the rumors had said. I staggered back, my mind racing, my breathing deeply hoarse. The photograph, the cold spots, the eerie wails, it all made sense now. The woman in the photo wasn't just a ghost, she was a harbinger, and her presence here was no accident. As the emergency services arrived and the office was filled with commotion, I noticed something chilling. The photograph was gone, vanished from its place on the wall. I'm not even sure if there really was a photograph on that wall. But one thing is clear, I don't think I'll be staying at this job much longer. I'm just probably gonna wait for this month's pay, then I'm getting the fuck out of here. Whatever is haunting this place is not finished with us, and I don't plan on finding out what happens when it decides that I'm its next call. Edit. 2 days after that incident, my neck feels a bit tight, and my chest would hurt at random times when I breathe. Also, I feel lightheaded. Might it be from sitting too long, or something else? Back in early August of last year, my husband Warren and I went on vacation. We were gonna do the tourist thing in one of the South's larger cities, but our trip was off to a rough start. We got stuck in baggage check-in for 2 hours. The self-check-in machines couldn't read our passports. When we finally got through, we got stuck in the security checkpoint and had to go through all our luggage. Because of all this, we missed our flight, and in turn, our connecting flight and a hotel transfer. We weren't pleased. After rebooking, we ended up with a total of 7 hours in delays before we got to the hotel, somewhere around 11 in the evening. At that point, it turned out we'd been double booked. They were full. I was about to explode, while Quarren looked ready to sink through the floor. Luckily, the hotel had a second location downtown. It was more modern, a bit more expensive, and overall nicer. As a courtesy for their mistake, we got a replacement suite, an upgrade. Finally, some good luck, right? Right. We took an Uber there. The place was practically brand new. They had this electronic system where you didn't get a key, you got a personalized code that worked on every door. Quarren handled the codes while I signed us in. There was a 24/7 bodega with organic snacks, wine, and drinks right by the lobby, a sushi restaurant that closed at 11, a sauna, a gym, an indoor pool, and a whole bunch of complimentary things. A couple of free robes to bring home, and a bottle of white wine with a little for your inconvenience note attached. While Quarren took a shower, I ordered us some food and unpacked. We'd been traveling all day, and all nearby restaurants were closed. As instructed, I included the code for the outer doors so they could drop the bag off by our door. We got our late night dinner by the time I was halfway through a shower. Quarren delightedly shared how he was going to town on our order. Apparently it was so good and barely any left. Bastard. They had included 2 extra orders of tiramisu as a little treat, but I couldn't eat it. It had coconut in it, my one allergy. All in all, that night turned out pretty good. We shared a lukewarm meal, watched The Office, and went to bed. We talked a bit about our plans for the next day, picking one thing each from our prep list: a tour of the local distillery, a museum trip, dinner at a steakhouse, the good stuff. So, after a long day, we called it a night. But that's where the story starts, at 3 a.m. that same night, when someone opened our door. See, one thing I hadn't realized was that the code of the outside door was the same as for our room. It was a single personal code system. Quarren had been the one dealing with it, and I hadn't thought too much about it. But what I'd accidentally done when ordering food was to essentially hand a stranger a key to our room, and that stranger was coming through the door. I tried to shake Quarren awake, but he didn't react. He was completely out, to a point that it worried me. I could smell something sour on his breath. My mind wandered back to the order we'd gotten and that extra portion of tiramisu. I hadn't had any, so he had chowed down on both. What if it had been laced with something? The door hinges creaked, and I didn't know what to do. I'm 5'3", unarmed, and in my underwear. I decided on a whim to pretend to sleep. If they were just there to steal, at least I'd be unharmed. They were expecting us to be asleep, so as long as I played along, I should be fine. I held Quarren, closed my eyes, and waited. Careful footsteps made their way across the hotel carpet. The door closed. A slow pacing back and forth next to our bed. I counted at least 2 people, maybe 3. Someone could have stayed by the door. Just the guy, a man whispered. Bag him. They were unwrapping plastic. They weren't in a rush. I could tell they'd done it before. They were quick about it. I held onto Quarren, debating in the back of my head what the hell I was supposed to do. I was leaning towards waiting for them to leave the room and then immediately run outside and get help. But something shifted. One of the intruders made a hushing noise and waved the other one over. What? One of them whispered. There! Another answered. The spoon! Since Quarren was the only one who'd had the tiramisu, one of the spoons were left unused. Only one of us had taken the bait. They knew one of us was awake. In the next breath, I was grappled. A hand covered my mouth, and another my throat. I was pulled out of bed before I even realized I was struggling. I opened my eyes to 3 dark figures. They were speaking over one another in a moment of panic. One of them saying they were screwed, another saying they should just go, and a third reminding them that they had no choice but to bring me. I got a gun pressed to the back of my neck. 1 word and you're done. Then we get him, understand? I did. I stayed quiet. I couldn't bear the thought of Quarren waking up without me, but what choice did I have? Get dressed, they demanded. Now! They brought me through the staff area, past the laundry room. There was only a skeleton crew working the hotel at night, and most of them were in the reception area. These 3 could walk me out the back like it was nothing. Right outside, they had an inconspicuous sedan marked with a fast food delivery service logo. They were still talking as they put me into the back seat. They had to improvise a bit. They were supposed to take Quarren, and he was supposed to be out cold. I was wide awake, trying my best to memorize details about the intruders and their vehicle. One of them took off his belt and tied it around my head as a makeshift blindfold. They couldn't drive around with masks on. That'd get them pulled over. They tried to camouflage my blindfold a bit with a trucker hat, and at a glance, you'd be excused for missing that it was a kidnapping. Why'd you want to bring the guy? One of them asked. Less hair gets stuck in the drain, the other mumbled. More meat. Sitting in the back of that car was surreal. All the familiar sounds of a calm drive. braking, accelerating, the clicking of turn signals, but all the while I felt the barrel of a gun poking into my side, right next to my heart. We were going pretty far out. There was at least a 40-minute ride, and we passed through a tunnel at some point. We must have used the highway. There were a lot of cars passing us. Then we went off-road. The road got rougher, and the sound of other cars faded. As we came to a stop, they all drew a collective sigh of relief. Out, now! They put their masks back on and took off my belt blindfold. I only caught a brief glimpse of the outside area before they shoved me through the door. It was this large old industrial site, probably abandoned. There was a chain-linked fence lining the property. There were no lights on the outside, but the place had power. Stepping inside, the temperature dropped. Somewhere nearby there were these large fans, creating a powerful draft that swept through the building. I couldn't see them, but even from the hallway I could hear them. The place was close to freezing. I just thrown on my pants, a shirt and shoes. I didn't even have socks on. One of the attackers went ahead while the other two stayed behind. We were in this long corridor with one door at each end, one leading outside and one leading further in. We stood there for a couple of minutes while I heard raised voices in the room up ahead. Those who stayed with me didn't say a word. They just looked straight ahead, keeping a gun aimed at me, not a word. The door at the other end opened. The third attacker returned, now in the company of what looked like a woman. She had sunglasses and a white face mask and was dressed in what can best be described as dollar store doctor scrubs. She seemed upset and was scolding the man in a foreign language, not sure about the origin, possibly Southeast Asian. One of the two men holding me seemed frustrated. He grunted. "Hey," he said. "What's the word?" "I don't know," the doctor woman groaned. "We always pick the man." So, she scoffed. "Could affect harvest, I don't know, hormones." She smacked something into the hands of the man next to her and turned to leave. "Prep her," she called out, as she hurried through the doors. "We try." I was dragged into a big open space. It looked like an old warehouse. The doctor was nowhere to be seen. She must have gone ahead. There were doors all over, and I was taken into what looked like a shower room. They proceeded to hold me down and shave my head, these long tufts of brown hair sinking into the drain. I hadn't had short hair since I was a kid. I felt naked. It just took them a couple of seconds. They were fast, practiced. They led me to a pair of double doors. One of them checked a digital watch. Another opened and tested a padlock. There was a collection of buckets next to the door, stained by something thick and blue. Time? 4:10. 4:10 or 4:11. 4:10. Check. They made a note on a piece of paper taped to the wall. "Should we tape her?" "Doesn't matter," the one with the padlock said matter-of-factly. "Been weeks. He's hungry." And that was it. The door swung open and I was pushed inside. The door slammed shut behind me, and I was on my own. The padlock clicked and the chains tightened. I just stood there for a moment, not even beginning to understand what was going on. After a couple of minutes, I snapped out of it. I wasn't immediately dead, so there was time to map the space I'd been thrown in. I was in a corridor branching off in 3 different directions. I got the impression that this was built recently. The corridor was no wider than 8 feet and had been wallpapered. Even the ceiling, it had an uncomfortable swirling pattern, a combination of white, brown, and purple. I'd never seen anything like it before. The ground was covered in a thick gray carpet. There were small fluorescent lights above, giving off this eerie illusion that the pattern on the walls were coming out. Somewhere off in the distance, there was a rhythmic thumping. It was getting closer, heavy footsteps approaching. I picked a direction and made a run for it. If you've never been chased by a predator, it is impossible to describe how it feels. It is, in a literal sense, dehumanizing. It makes you feel like less of a person. You become an animal, a thing, prey. You have to look at yourself and what you are, and what you can do, in a completely new light. It forces you to come to terms with the most honest, primal version of yourself. It is horrifying. It brought to light how long it had been since I ran, and how impractical my shoes were. I ended up kicking them off, barely stopping. I went down one corridor, then another, then another. I rushed past a small room with what looked like a pile of pillows in the middle. It stunk of ammonia, so I decided to take another route. It was getting harder and harder to tell where that rhythmic thumping was coming from, and it felt like I was about to run into something at every turn. Then I rounded a corner and saw someone. 2 people, a man and a woman, both dressed in bright blue wool-like turtlenecks. They had their arms firmly at their sides, and stood shoulder to shoulder in a very unnatural and rigid manner, like 2 kids trying to hide something behind their backs. I stopped for a moment. I thought I wasn't the only one locked in there, that maybe, just maybe, there were others. Maybe we could work together? Then I realized that the thumping had stopped. The moment I saw these 2, it was as if whatever was chasing me had stopped. The 2 of them lurched forward. It wasn't a step, it was like 2 mannequins being pushed. I turned to run as the thumping resumed, this time right behind me. I ran, screaming. All your senses go into hyper-focus, and you get 100 thoughts running through your head at once. Whatever minute detail your eye accidentally latches onto is burned into your mind. To this day, I can recall the little things I noticed as I sprinted down the hall. Scratch marks breaking the pattern on the wallpaper, stains on the carpet, dark spatter on the ceiling. I ended up back at the room with the pillows. I decided to hide. Hurrying in, I realized it wasn't just a pillow room. This was some sort of lair. There was debris, branches, leaves, flowers, dirt. I dove right in and covered myself with as much as possible, ignoring the smell. I only had a couple of seconds. I was so panicked that I almost swallowed a flower petal, some kind of dry blue sunflower. I held my breath and hoped. The thumping grew closer, then it slowed to a tip-tap, clicking. From where I was hiding, I could barely see anything. I could kind of see the edge of a turtleneck sweater. Then something shifted. Now I only saw the silhouette, but what I saw it didn't make sense. It was those 2 people I'd seen, but they were sort of moving. Their arms twisted in an unnatural angle, looking more like insect mandibles. Their heads bobbed back and forth like some kind of growth or tail. Their chests vibrated and stretched as they slowly came undone. They weren't 2 people. They were a single thing, pretending. Seconds later, something grabbed my leg. I was pulled out of the nest and dragged away at a violent speed. I flopped back and forth, slamming into the walls with every sharp turn. I broke 2 fingers by the second turn. I couldn't turn to see what had grabbed me, so I just tried to hold on to something, anything. The carpet, the wallpaper, the walls, whatever I could. But the force was just too strong. There was no way. Then it stopped. I rolled over onto my back and came face to face with my attacker, and I didn't understand. To this day, I have a hard time describing it. There were so many moving parts, segmented muscles, like living steel wires, mandibles, and a beak-like mouth, patches of bright blue hair covering 4 extremities, and part of a thorax, a pulsating abdomen. Something warm dripped onto my leg, drool, perhaps, or a mild acid. It had the same color as the stains in the buckets I'd seen by the door leading into this place. It was a strange blue, and for some reason, that detail just sort of stuck. There were so many little movements at once, and I couldn't even get the scope of how big it really was. It seemed bigger than me, but it could just have long limbs. I couldn't make sense of it. It seemed insectoid, but its movement seemed calculated and intelligent. Then pain, a bright, burning pain. I mentally blacked out. I flailed, spasmed, and kicked. It had me by the leg, and something sharp had pierced my thigh, picking at my flesh. I could feel my muscle pulling away from me. It was going to snap. I've never felt so vulnerable and exposed. To feel so mortal, it scars you in ways you can't understand unless you've been there. Then it pulled back, letting me go. Mandibles moved, clicking, hissing. I'd never seen anything like this thing before, but I understood it. It was such a human motion in a way. It didn't like me. I tasted bad, and that made it angry. It disappeared down the corridor. I just lay there panting. I didn't even attempt to move. I knew it would hurt like nothing else had. A couple of minutes passed, I think, maybe an hour. It was impossible to tell. In the distance, I could hear the rattle of the padlock. Perhaps my captors had heard my screams and figured that thing was done with me. Either way, they were coming in. But the moment I heard the door open, things took a sudden turn. Screams and shrieks, gunfire, thumping, popping, clicking, screeching. There was this one noise like a large rubber band snapping in two as a scream suddenly stopped. Panicked voices growing more distant. I sat up and used my arms and one good leg to scooch away. It took a long time, but it was the only way I could move. I didn't dare to look at my thigh, but I could tell it was bad. At least a 2-inch gash. I figured it hadn't hit an artery at least, or I would be dead already. The moment I could see the double doors, I realized something had gone very wrong. The door was covered in a massive splotch of blood still dripping. Scooching my way out the door, I saw the aftermath of something. The floor was covered in blood and viscera, some which was still moving. I couldn't tell where one person began and the other ended. My hands got slippery as I scooched down the hall, inch by inch. There was still the occasional scream. Someone was being chased. Making my way through that room was a living nightmare. Every now and then, I'd recognize something human, like a hand or piece of a leg. I just pushed through. I was doing the movement out of habit at that point. I couldn't have stopped even if I wanted to. A final scream came to a stop. All that was left was the sound of dripping and me dragging my wounded leg across the floor in the long corridor leading outside. I found a pile of torn fabric. I didn't want to look at it, but I could see a bit of denim in there. I recalled one of my attackers wearing jeans and decided to take a gamble. I had to feel my way through something I'm not even going to attempt to describe, but I found car keys. As I made my way outside, I managed to prop myself up against the door and limp. Something must have hit a nerve. I had trouble moving my foot. It didn't even hurt. It just didn't work properly. I made it all the way to their car. My hands were pale white from blood loss, and I couldn't stop shaking. Looking back, there was no trace of the thing they'd kept in there. I got in, locked the doors, and took a deep breath. Looking back, I noticed something by the entrance. The doctor. She was coming out of the building, dripping with unspeakables. She seemed unharmed, but must have been in the thick of it. She could barely stand and seemed just haunted. An empty gun dropped from her hand. She looked my way briefly and then just wandered off. The word that comes to mind was defeated. Blank. I looked down for a second as I put the car in reverse. Looking back up, I saw that thing. It was standing by the entrance, again looking like two people in blue turtlenecks. Stained with red, it looked my way, as if considering whether or not to allow me to leave. For a brief moment, it was quiet. We just looked at one another. Then it just closed the doors and retreated back inside. I managed to make it to a gas station. The owner called the police, and the rest is history. I don't think a lot of people read the articles about this. It was deemed as a drug-related gang thing, as the people involved were producing illicit substances. While I agree with this description to a point, I find it wildly misleading. Yes, that thing produced something, but what it was and what it was used for, God knows. I've talked to Corin about this 1,000 times, but it's impossible to make others see and understand what happened that night. It was just a couple of hours all in all, but it completely turned my life around for the worse. To this day, my one foot is a lot duller than the other, and I always double and triple check my locks. I made a lot of mistakes that night. I didn't know how the hotel codes worked. Maybe I didn't fight enough when they brought me outside. Maybe it was stupid trying to hide. Maybe this whole thing boils down to me having the worst luck in the world to encounter this, and the greatest luck in the world to survive it. Corin claims I have some kind of PTSD. I don't think he's wrong, but I don't think that tells the whole story. See, sometimes I see these people in the distance that just looks off. Two people standing in a peculiar pose, one person and two kids standing deep inside an alley, only to be gone the next time you look. I'm sure some of it is just trauma creeping back to the surface. I'm sure it is. But not all of it.